So I'm going to talk to you about the meeting point of two very different traditions. The one is the Western classical music tradition, which is a written tradition, which is based around a group of works which are obviously continually expanding by composers, which are then interpreted through the written score by a multitude of performers. So you can have one particular composition and you can hear it in many different versions by many different performers. On the other side is the tradition of the griots of West Africa, which is a group of families which pass a musical tradition and a musical repertoire from generation to generation and have done so for hundreds of years. So the music of the griots that I've particularly focused on is the music of the kora. The kora is a 21-string harp. It's made from a large calabash which is covered in an animal skin. It has a long neck and 21 strings. And it's one of the most beautiful and complex instruments. And the musician whose kora playing I first heard is a griot called Toumani Diabate. And Toumani made an album in 1987 at the age of 21, which completely reinvented kora playing and brought all the elements of the griot's musical tradition, which would normally be played by a group of musicians, all into a single instrument. So single-handedly at this very young age, he invented the solo kora. He calls it Simultaneous Kora. So in his playing, you hear the three elements of this music. The bass line, which could be something like this, which on the kora would be played by the left-hand thumb, because the kora, unlike a guitar, is a harp, so all the strings are just played, by themselves. They're not stopped. So while the left-hand thumb continually plays this bass line, the right-hand thumb would play the accompaniment, which would then normally be the time when the singer would start to sing, or the second kora player, or whatever other instrument is playing. So what Toumani did was, using the index fingers, which is usually used for the melodic playing, without stopping the original parts, he brought in all the melodic aspects, creating this very beautiful solo music. So I first heard this music very many years ago without knowing any context. I've still to this day never been to West Africa, and before I started playing this music I had no contact with kora players or even actually seen a kora. So my approach to learning this music was to use the skills of a classical musician and to read the music which I experienced through recordings as musical scores, just like I would the music of Bach or any other composer. So I started by listening to Toumani's album, Kaira, and finding ways to write this down and finding ways to translate this music onto the guitar, finding new tunings and new techniques. And the first piece I did was a piece called Tubaka, which is a love song, which I later found out had originally been a guitar piece. So there's this constant move from instrument to instrument, but the way of playing the guitar is very, very different to the classical way. So these arrangements are exactly as the kora would be played, but translated to the guitar. So I'll play you now Tubaka, which I worked out note by note over a very long time. So after many hours of work, I would hear a few seconds of music, but it was, as you can imagine, very exciting because up until that time, Toumani had been having all the fun by himself, you know. Thank you. So the primary difference now in my approach to this music is that I'm approaching it as an interpreter of compositions. And when I first heard about this music, I was told that Toumani is a traditional musician. He's a griot, he's an improviser, and he plays traditional pieces which have been passed down over many years. And this is the lens that I first listened to his music, and I thought that in order to touch as a musician a music like this, I would need to learn this particular style of playing, I would need to learn this language, and I would need to be able to improvise in this language. And this is a very different concept of playing music than in the classical tradition, which works with the interpretation of set scores. So one day I started to hear the music differently after listening to it many times, you know, over 10 years or something. Maybe the only album I listen to a bit sometimes. And I started to realize, especially in about 2007, Toumani released another album, his second solo album 20 years later. And on it, he did the same piece that he'd done, one piece he repeated. And I listened to these two versions and I realized that they were very, very similar. It was like listening to perhaps Glenn Gould's two performances of the Goldberg Variations, which were also separated by a large span of time. And it was then that I realized that this was a traditional musician playing a traditional music, but this was also a composer, and actually a great African composer, a really phenomenal composer. So slowly writing down this music, and that piece that I talked about was the first piece, Jarabi, which means passion. It is a traditional piece, but the way that Toumani plays it is very, very different and very, very uniquely his. And it would be the same as, for instance, a chaconne, which is a traditional form from many hundreds of years ago in Europe. But there's a famous one by J.S. Bach, which many classical musicians play today. So there's an analogy here, the only difference being that Toumani's scores exist only in recording. And so this process of writing down the scores has now opened it up. And there are quite a number of musicians around the world now, guitarists, string quartets, guitar duos. There's even a harpist or two playing this music from these scores that I've made and interpreting them in very, very different ways to how Toumani would have interpreted them, and also different to how I interpret them. So in this way, the music is being passed on outside of the tradition, which would normally be kept in the families. And this way of passing on is continuing still. We saw last year, Toumani recorded a 2-kora album with his son Siddiqui, who was also about 21 or 22. And they made a very beautiful album for 2 koras. So my closing piece is going to be the piece Miniamba. It's an old piece from the griot repertoire, but this version was taken from the 2-kora version of Toumani and his son Siddiqui and condensed onto one instrument, made into a score. So here we see the griot tradition being passed on from father to son. Thank you.